Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of our Medical History Book Club. Ordinarily, the book club meets about 3 or 4 times a year, and we have 8 or 12 people across the screen, and we discuss a book. But today is different. We have the privilege of having the author of the book we chose to speak with us and to be interviewed today. And so we've run it a little different, inviting other people to join us. And to interview our author about this new book that we found so interesting. Now, if any of you who are not in the book club are interested in joining the book club, just let me know, put it in the chat, and I will contact you and we will get that taken care of. But for today, we're going to enjoy an interview with Sande Bishop, author of Stalking the Doctors of the Full Moon. And Sande is a longtime friend of the Worcester District Medical Society and came to Worcester with her husband, Dick Bishop, who was a cardiologist at the Fallon Clinic and later an executive at the St. Vincent Hospital. Several years ago, they retired and moved down to Virginia. And unfortunately, in September of 21, Dick passed away, and this is a loss that everyone who knows him, who knew him, feels. But we're lucky today to have Sande with us, and she has written this wonderful book. And we wanted to go through this and just go over her experience and go over what kinds of things she learned in doing this, and then we can explore it with questions from the audience. So first, we're going to have the interview. The two of us are going to discuss the book. And then we will open it up for questions. Welcome, Sande. And let's.
Nice to be here.
Yes. So let's see here. How did you get into this project? How did this all begin?
I had been writing a column in Worcester Medicine for quite a few years and been doing a lot of research on local medical history. And at some point, Joyce Cariglia, who was at the Medical Society then, said, we have this box of some kind of old papers in the closet. Have you ever seen it? And she pulled it out, and it was just a treasure box. In all the places that I'd been doing research, the Antiquarian Society, the Historical Museum, and so forth, I'd never seen papers like this. I'd seen doctors' day books and journals, but nothing like this. And as I poured through it, there was just paper after paper. It turned out there were more than 400 of them in this book, all dissertations by these doctors who met at the full Monday of after the full of the moon to discuss medicine and professionalism and have some companionship as well. And it was just a treasure. I had never seen anything like it. And so she said, would you like to transcribe them? Would you like to spend some time with them? And that was just, it was an open invitation. And I plowed through 400, and I don't remember, 424 or something like that of these papers. Some had very legible handwriting. Others were typical doctor's scribbles, I guess. That's been a time-honored tradition. There were some very interesting things, like in the early papers, there were very non-standardized spelling to the point that some doctors would spell the same word 2 or 3 different ways in the same paper. No punctuation or anything. By the end of that decade, they were all writing in perfect spelling and sentence structure. And on digging around a little bit, I found out that that's when Noah Webster had published his dictionary, which was called the blue-backed speller. And it was second only in sales to the Bible for more than a century. More than 70 million of them were sold. I mean, it was tremendous. And these doctors just jumped onto it and made their writing standard.
Spelling. So this was 1835.
This was 1834, 1835, yeah.
And for about a decade or so, 1845?
Yes.
And this was in the Blackstone Valley?
This was in the Blackstone Valley. They met in the town of Mendon, which was made of 7 villages, I think. Blackstone and Milford were considered, Hopedale were villages in the town of Mendon. they met on the Monday after the full of the moon because they needed to go home by the moonlight in their horse and buggies, and that was the best time to do it. So it took me a little while to figure out why they chose that time, but after a while it became clear that they wanted the extra moonlight.
So the Union Medical Association, Blackstone Valley, what about the Blackstone Valley at that time? What can you tell us about that era?
This is an incredible era. It is so far distant from where we are today that it's just hard to understand what life must have been like. It was a time of transition. They were moving from the agricultural life into the industrial world. Some of the earliest mills were all in that area, the Blackstone. So you had sawmills and grist mills and manufacturing mills. I think there were 4 woolen mills and numerous cotton mills, and so it was a very active and prosperous area.
It was the center of the Industrial Revolution as it started in America.
Yes,
this is where the cloth mills started, and taking advantage of that water power. They were building dams up and down along the rivers, and as a result, there were a lot of accidents for the workers that were digging the dams and so forth, and several of those were described in detail in some of the papers. One of the things that became clear was we think of an ambulance showing up immediately if you have an accident. At a mill accident where one person eventually had to have an arm amputated, he waited 7 hours for the doctor to get there, and then another 2 for the surgeon to be able to show up. So just in terms of the immediacy of medical care, there's a big difference. The towns were, I think you have to just say dirty. The roads were dirt, so they were dusty or muddy. You had horses, and horses leave a little behind as well. The streets were full of. They kept hog pens in the center of town, where I think they threw their garbage. They had the outhouses were often called common vaults, where many, many families would use them. So the stench, or as they called it, the miasma, was just dreadful in the towns in the summertime, particularly. And there were a lot of epidemics in the summer. It seemed like whenever you had epidemics being reported, it was always August or September, when the heat would be bad and the water table would be low. So the town, the era and the area were so different from anything we are familiar with. And medicine itself, the span we're talking about here, 1830s, early 1840s, was kind of the end of an era almost. It was just butting up against all of the scientific discoveries regarding hygiene and infectious disease and anesthesia that were going to occur starting in the 1840s. So talk a little bit about medicine as these doctors knew it.
Well, you're exactly right. It was getting close to the end of an era, and the era had lasted for a couple of thousand years, basically. We were talking about medicine based on Hippocrates' principles of 4 humors, and Galen had popularized that, and his work had been used in the earliest of medical schools in Europe. They based it on the 4 humors, and in all of the papers, when they were discussing a patient, just as you take a medical history, they took a medical history. It would say Mrs. O or Mr. F, usually just an initial. And then that they would list the gender, the age, and then they would list the humoral description. So they would either be of sanguine characteristics or phlegmatic. There were the 4: sanguine and black bile, was melancholic. And so they would list that, and that was very important as to how they treated them, because they thought that all 4 humors had to be in balance, and that illness happened when one of the humors was out of balance. And so the typical way to look after that was to bleed, blister, puke, and purge, as they said. So it was all just a matter of figuring out which needed to be eliminated. Dr. Allen, in one of the earliest of the papers, said that everything came back to the blood and how much blood there was. And if you took two ships, he said, and one sailed north and one sailed south, the sailors on both, if they went too far, would get dysentery because one would sweat too much, and so the blood would be out of balance, or the other, I think he described it as their sweat would be choked, so their blood would also be out of balance. Everything just came back to the four humors.
Mm-hmm. And so this was an era in which these doctors were using these traditions that they'd been trained in. And even the training itself was a little different, the education that doctors had in those days from what we expect today. Talk a little bit about, how they got trained in those days.
Well, there were two ways you could get trained. First of all, there was no such thing as a license. So anybody who wanted could hang up a shingle. And then there were just beginning to be medical schools, really. In 1800, there were only two in New England, Harvard and Dartmouth. And then medical schools were for-profit and would be formed by a group of physicians who wanted to teach and make extra money that way. And by 1830, there were 8 medical schools in New England. So there was quite a jump just within 30 years. The teachers would be paid individually by the students, and depending on the fame of the doctor, would be Dr. Warren of Harvard seemed to have always been paid the highest amount. He would get paid $20 in the 1820s and 30s per student for the year. Mm-hmm. If the physician felt he didn't have enough subscribers, he would cancel the course and say, it's not worth my time not to do this. So you could go to medical school. You did not have to have a college degree to do that. You could go straight to medical school. Medical school was 2 years. The second year was exactly the same as the first. And Dr. Metcalf even complained that the doctors didn't even bother to change their jokes from the first year to the second year while he was there. So if you decided not to go to medical school or couldn't afford to go to medical school, and it was fairly expensive, it would add up to about $70 a year. And when you look at the way other things cost, that was an expense. And a lot of the doctors actually did start medical school and didn't finish, and you mm-hmm. presume it was for financial reasons. You could just do an apprenticeship. And that was another way doctors made money, was by taking on apprentices. And an apprentice would pay about $100 a year. But part of that could be paid in chopping wood or looking after the horses and things like that. So that and apprenticeships were usually 3 years. Mm-hmm. So you could go either route, medical school.
In those days, it was maybe half and half.
Often they did both.
Yeah, or both, right. You're exactly right. Now, these doctors, therefore, had this education. They had these traditions they were following. But they were feeling that maybe that wasn't enough, that they didn't have all the answers. And so they decided that they would form this Union Medical Association and meet once a month and discuss their cases. And it looks like they were pretty strict about it. If you joined, you had to show up and you had to present a case. Otherwise, you were fined.
This is true. Everyone had to have a case each month. If you didn't have it, you were fined 25 cents. And several of them came up with papers very quickly. They admitted in the paper just so that they wouldn't have to pay that 25-cent fine. So mm-hmm. that obviously wasn't trifling to them.
They wanted to learn from each other. They felt it wasn't over when they were done with their education at the beginning.
They did. To join, you had to apply and they had to accept you. And that was probably a difficult balance. They wanted to be open enough to have enough people enough doctors from the area around their table, but they did not want to have people that they thought were not as qualified. And so you had to apply and be accepted. Mm-hmm. There were 27 doctors, I think, in all that were part of the organization at different times. The book basically is written from the papers of about 7 of them. There were 7 that were members pretty much the entire decade and contributed many really interesting papers.
And and those who are on the webinar should know that those papers are still at the Worcester Historical Society. We can still see them. And in fact, we could look at a page or two if you wanted to just get a sense as to what they were turning in.
I think it would be lovely if you showed a couple of papers.
Why don't we look at Dr. Metcalf here just to see what you have seen. So this here is a recording his records of his deliveries. He did on 300 deliveries. He wrote down their weights and wrote down other statistics about them. And then let me just give you a few more here. Let's see, here we go. So we have cases.
Dr. Metcalf had the most meticulous handwriting of all of the doctors. He also loved to keep charts, and he loved to write. He recorded everything. It was a wonderful journal that he wrote while he was at medical school, telling all about his classes and his experience there. I relied on him a great deal. He became sort of a favorite because he just recorded so much that, and he also mentored a lot of them. And a number of the younger doctors who joined the group had apprenticed with him. And then in later years, during the Civil War, this is not part of the book, but he acted as a father figure to many of the young doctors that did go off too. And they wrote him, and those letters are all at the Antiquarian Society also.
Yes. So what we've got then is a group that you were investigating, and you went far beyond just the records. I was impressed that when somebody said they graduated from Dartmouth, you contacted Dartmouth.
I did. After I transcribed all those papers, and then I sort of sat around for a while. I didn't know what to do with that information. But I was fascinated by the doctors, and I wanted to know more about them. So just any little hint that I could find about their lives and who they were. And so I did. I went to all the different historical societies in the area to find out what they had. I went to the courthouse and went through probate records. I did contact all the colleges and medical schools where they claimed to have gone, and some I found out weren't quite as honest about their qualifications as we had been made to believe. Some things don't change, I guess. No, I tried to track down any little hint, that church records, anything that I could find that helped. Several of them, Dr. Metcalf being one, and Dr. Southwick and Dr. Ballou, all served on town committees in their towns. So they had records of being on school boards or assessors or something like that too.
These people had practices. They were on, like you say, the assessors or the clerks or the school boards. They met once a month. They prepared their reports. Really remarkable to me that all of this was happening. And I think that we heard a little bit of critical thinking on their part. I think part of the reason they were meeting is they felt that the way they were practicing deserved a little extra scrutiny, and that perhaps there were other ways to do things.
The doctors, this group of doctors, one of the things that makes the papers, I think, really unique is because these doctors, they were reporting on what they were doing day by day. So these were pretty honest reports of the way medicine was, compared to some of the things you read, say, by Oliver Wendell Holmes or Benjamin Rush and so forth. These were famous doctors who knew that what they were writing was for posterity, so it was a very different nature. These doctors were very honest about the fact that they didn't know. And at one time, one of the doctors said that he was humiliated by the amount that medicine didn't know, that bothered him. And it was interesting to watch as they kind of fluctuated. They had been educated and they believed thoroughly in the humoral system of medicine, but at the same time, they knew it wasn't quite giving them what they needed. And there were times when they would write dissertations about infection and contagion that they they were inching up. They were almost at an understanding, but they somehow that scientific education just wouldn't quite let them go. And they didn't have the instruments to be able to, viruses were not known, bacteria weren't known. The microscopes that they had were too primitive to really be of help in medical situations. I think the stethoscope was existent, but not a single one of them mentions it. One of them talks about how to auscultate, but that was quite late. That was in the 1840s, and he was obviously just learning the procedure at that point. So, Pasteur and Lister are still in the future. Oliver Wendell Holmes in the 1840s, I think, wrote a paper about hand washing, and he was just about laughed out of town for the idea. Right. Doctors are gentlemen; their hands are always clean.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I think they were also, I think patients also figured out that maybe this bleeding and purging and blistering wasn't the most wonderful thing in the world. So they were simultaneously trying to improve their practice, but they were also faced with some competition by others who, among other things, didn't seem to hurt the patients as much.
The competition at this period was probably as great as it had been in any time in medical history. You had homeopathy, you had mesmerism, you had Grantism, you had Thomsonianism, water cures, just every type of medical practice that you can believe in. Many of them did not bleed. And so there was great attraction for those types of medicine. And yet these doctors, almost in every case, except in midwifery cases, they bled.
Mm-hmm.
And the question usually was, did I bleed enough? And any papers on bleeding weren't whether to bleed or not to bleed. It was where to bleed and how much. Should you bleed from the finger? Should you bleed from the arm? Should you bleed from the temple? It was that kind of questioning. They actually reported on some of their competitors who didn't bleed and had good results, and yet they couldn't quite make the leap that maybe they should look into that a little more. It was just, it was tantalizing that they could come so close and not quite make that jump.
Okay. And let's see, what other characteristics do we want to cover here? We talked about the fact that they were just bumping into the science. We talked about the competition and the work that you did with regard to researching out these individuals and putting them in the context of their time.
I think one of the areas that we could talk about, just touch on, is the incredible competition with midwifery and doctors entering into that field. Up until about this time, delivering babies had been purely in the hands of midwives, unless it was complicated. And then the women were wise enough to know to call in a doctor if it was going to be a breech or something, or shoulder or something difficult. But for the most part, all deliveries were done by women, and it was the women's world. At this time, doctors started delivering babies, saying that they had scientific knowledge, so they would be much better at doing it, which is kind of interesting because none of them ever got to see a naked female. If you went to school in Paris, you would learn the female anatomy, but it was still considered too delicate a matter in New England. So any knowledge of the female body they had was purely from books. And there are many cases where they kind of lament that if I had been able to put my eyes on the problem, maybe I could have solved it, that those women just were not going to lift their skirts for a male. So, and the competition, the doctors really denigrated the midwives. They called them old grannies and didn't like them coming into the birthing room. And obviously the midwives were very resentful of the doctors taking over their jobs and incomes too. So that was a very nasty and prolonged battle.
So there were women practicing medicine, but they weren't medical school graduates, I imagine. Besides the midwives, where the first medical school graduate occurred in 1849 in the United States. So Were there women out there practicing medicine without a degree?
You see ads in the newspapers and so forth of the time of women, but it usually is pretty much just women's issues that they wanted to treat.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see them advertising, particularly as a general physician.
Okay. And besides facing competition, wondering about the utility of a lot of their treatments, their curiosity carried them to the point where they were doing their own postmortems. You
Yes,
described that.
a little bit. They wanted to do a lot more. They were always urging their colleagues to try to get more autopsies, to try to do more autopsies. They described a couple of them briefly, but not in exquisite detail. And I never did figure out exactly where those were taking place. I have to assume that it was in one of the doctor's offices who was in the downtown. Maybe Dr. Metcalf's office or Dr. Ballou's office, or maybe even Dr. Wilder. Dr. Wilder also did some legal things out of his office. So it might be that was an office of all purposes.
Wow.
But
So we're getting to the point where we can open it up for questions. So I want those who are watching to either put a question in or say, recognize me or whatever, and I'll pop you onto the screen so that we can give everyone an opportunity to speak with the author. So just go ahead and put your questions in now if you have one, or anything else that you'd like to do from a point of view of commenting at all. Now, these people were also members of the Worcester Medical Society, but they felt our society up here right now was not quite intense enough for them. They were just having an occasional meeting, and they weren't necessarily as quality oriented, I guess, as these individuals were.
One of the doctors said that the Union Medical Association, their local organization that met, was much more educational. That when they went to the Worcester one, they met in a tavern, and there was much eating and drinking, and not much medicine. Maybe a speaker. They mentioned that several times the speaker failed to show up. So I think it was the Worcester at that point was more social than it was educational, intellectual. Yeah.
Wow. And I would say that the other thing is, although they had offices, the overwhelming amount of their practice was going to the patient's house. So there was going to be someone going to get the doctor, or they would try to find the doctor.
Exactly.
Nothing happened in a hurry.
No. They talk about either they were using a horse buggy chaise, or at times walking, and it appears that there could be days that they would cover more than 100 miles in a day, visiting patients. And often late into the evening.
Now, Rohit Vakale asks, were there hospitals in the Worcester area at that time?
Hospitals were usually, at that point, more for if there was an outbreak of a specific disease. It was more of almost a quarantine situation. The state hospital for mental had started up during that period. They're the one in Worcester, with the humane care
asylum, 1831,
so that was available, and several of the doctors refer their patients to the mental institution. So they were aware of it, and they did use it. There were poorhouses that basically acted like hospitals or clinics for people that were struggling and had no money.
Right. Okay. Julie Powers is here. Julie, do you want to come in? We can pop you onto the screen here if you like.
Hi,
There we
Sandy.
go.
Thanks so
Hi,
much
Julie. Julie's
Hi.
joining us from California.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so I have a couple questions. I'll just do this one. The differences between Dr. Metcalf's obstetrical practice and Martha Ballard's midwifery practice just a couple decades earlier up in Maine, I found really astonishing. For example, there seems to be an inordinate number of shoulder presentations and transverse lies in Dr. Metcalf's practice. And I'm wondering whether you have any insight into whether this was something about the populations. Were there more contracted pelvies in Worcester County because of poor nutrition? Was it because Martha Ballard would have already referred the transverse lies out to the physician, or what else was going on there?
I really don't know, but my guess would be that Martha Ballard, as a midwife, would have already passed those cases along. I think that was a pretty standard operating procedure for most midwives, that if it looked difficult, they stepped back. They knew their limitations. They didn't use forceps or ergot or any of the things that the doctors were using at that point. They understood nature and how nature worked, and that was their methodology. But I'm afraid I can't help you beyond that.
Thank you.
Okay. Tony Esposito, let me promote you to panelist here.
I'm on audio, I believe.
You are on audio. We can hear you fine. If you want to get on video, just, open it up.
That's quite all right. Sandy, thank you for a very, very intriguing presentation. Given the rigors of the era, what would you guess the average longevity of these physicians were? Did they live to be gray-haired old men, or did they push off a lot earlier?
Most of this group lived to be gray-haired old men. There were a couple who died young. One in particular, that I did get all of his records from the probate, and he left his wife with small children and lots of debts, which was sad. But the majority of them lived ripe old ages, 70s, 80s.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, I think that kind of that was taken into consideration in early years in medical school applicants, that the robust individual more likely to be accepted to a medical school than someone who had any evidence of a frailty, because in part the expectation was to work until you had gray hair and then some. In any case, thank you so much.
That's fascinating.
Okay, Lynn Eckert, I just promoted you to panelist. You can talk and hop on the video as well. Yeah.
Okay. Actually,
Lou.
Faye's in here, and Lynn's next to me, and she may have some comments. But I just wanted to mention two other medical societies that Sandy, I'm sure, is aware of. One of them is Dr. Thurber was involved with, who was mentioned in the book quite a bit as an outstanding physician. And this medical society is a little later, and it was called the Thurber Medical Society. It was actually founded after his death in 1853 in the Milford area, Franklin, Mass area. And it's profiled in the New England Journal of Medicine, October 4th, 1928, because it was the 75th year of this society. It's amazing. And they, again, were a group who were trying to better medicine, but also having delightful luncheons, which were served by nurses. And so there was a lot of comedy and good fellowship with this society. But they did last 75 years. And actually, at their 50th, Theodore Osgood Cornish of Boston was still alive to celebrate the 50th. But that article in the New England Journal was written about their 75th. And I'll just quickly say they did have a library. They put together a library which went to the New Milford Hospital in 1903. So that was the Thurber Medical Society, a little later.
Interesting.
I actually tracked them down, and I went to Milford Hospital, who very kindly shared a lot of information with me. That society was started by Dr. Metcalf, who was part of the one that I have spoken of, that was part of this group. Dr. Thurber had been his mentor. He had apprenticed with Dr. Thurber 1 year. And held him in very high esteem, mentioned him, as you say, a number of times. And many of these doctors had apprenticed with with him. But when I went in the when I was writing this book to Milford, they told me that they still were running that medical society, and they were very proud of the fact that they were such an old, continuing medical society. So I think it may still be in existence.
It's interesting, yes, that they refused to become part of the Worcester District Medical Society.
That's right.
The other, sorry,
Go ahead.
okay.
Go ahead, Lou. I was going to mention one thing, and that is that we have an electronic book available on the Worcester District Medical Society website. If you click on the history section, it is entitled Hospitals and Other Medical Societies of Worcester County, the History. And it was written in 1951, I think, by Paul Bergen. So we have an electronic copy of that, and you can look up all these, many of these medical societies there. Go ahead, Lou. What were you going to say next?
Maybe a little of a stretch, but 3 or 4 years ago, before COVID, Lynn and I traveled to London with a group from the New York Times, and we were able to take part in the a formal dinner of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in
Right.
London. And this was formalized in 1815, but the history of this society is that they went back to 1624 when King James designated that the apothecaries were different than the grocers, because the grocers was another economic unit that they were selling spices and herbs and other foods, but the spices and herbs then of the apothecaries became separate in 1624. And one thing that was amazing in England, the result of this is that the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries became doctors. They became the doctors of England. And their practice was based on medicines, wherever they came from roots and so forth. And they were the medical practitioners of England, maybe general medical doctors to begin with. But up until recently, they provided licensure and practice guidelines for medical practitioners, which excluded surgeons. And so surgeons so the doctors in England to this day, doctors are medical practitioners. And if you saw someone doing surgery, that would be Mr. That's a Mr. Jones, not because the surgeons came from a different background, dealing more with meat cutters and dentists and people involved in surgical procedures. So they are Mr., whereas the doctor in England today is a medical practitioner.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Lou, if I can take a moment here, just to plug, we have a tour coming up June 6th through 15th of England, a medical history tour of England, and the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries is on the itinerary. We have a professional tour guide, and yeah. So
looks like a wonderful trip.
We can make the literature for that available to anyone who might be interested. It's going to be a terrific trip. I'm sorry, Sandy, what were you going to say?
I said it sounds like a wonderful trip. That is one of the interesting differences between when the English medicine and American, the medical physicians and the surgeons were so separated, but when medicine was practiced here, there was no differentiation. Why that happened, I don't know, but it's a very distinct difference.
So Fred Schwartz, I'm going to promote to panelist. Fred, you had a question?
Unmute. How about now?
There. Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay. Now
we'll hear you.
Okay. So my question is, I'm curious, in your time at the American Antiquarian Society, what kind of documents did you come across in terms of medical history in Worcester or with this group in the Blackstone? Could you tell me more? Could you tell us more about what you found?
Dr. Metcalf left a number of his papers there, particularly the letters that he dealt with the doctors during the Civil War, a little later than this period. Also, as I mentioned, his recounting of his time in medical school is there. Fascinating account of day by day. He describes his professors and what they were talking about and how interesting they were and how he spent his time. He stayed in a boarding house in Boston, and he describes it all. There wasn't a whole lot to do with this group beyond Dr. Metcalf and Dr. Leland at the Antiquarian Society. There was a lot of tangential material out of the newspapers. I could find out what was going on in the towns and the advertisements by other competing physicians and midwives of that time. They do have a lot of doctored log books that just sort of gave you an idea of what procedures other doctors were doing and so forth, but there wasn't as much. I really had to dig, I guess is what I'm saying, for the information I found. I didn't find a lot in any one place.
Oh, thank you for that.
Okay. Sally Svita, I'm just going to let you talk here. It might be a little faster than trying to get you on video.
Okay, thank you. Sally Svita, Charles River, and thank you for opening it up to the whole MMS. This has been most interesting. I was curious as you described the doctors and described the Industrial Revolution and the factories, et cetera, that began to be built in this area. Did the doctors think they needed to change any of their practices if they were seeing more injuries and things like that from the factories and the mills?
They did not make that suggestion, but what did come out of that mill culture was they were seeing that progress being made, and they thought that more progress should be being made in the medical arts. There were several discussions about a division of labor, and perhaps it would be better to specialize. And they even
Interesting.
I think it might have been tongue in cheek, but they would say, well, Dr. Allen does so many of this procedure, so maybe he should be in charge of those and do all of those. And so they even were thinking about which doctors would be best in different, and that came directly from the division of labor in the mills. So it did have an effect on their thinking.
They didn't train more surgeons?
A very forward-thinking time anyway, with progress and the development of a middle class and capitalism. Andrew Jacksonian era was profit-making, and they were much more interested in practical applications of medicine and not a lot of interest in theoretical research, medical.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob Terrell, I'm just going to put you on to talk right now.
The thing that strikes home to me is my ancestors are basically probably 2 generations later, but in rural Maine. And some of the parallels, you're talking about that the physicians would be involved in more than just medicine. And I know my great-grandfather was like the town moderator, and he was on the board of trustees at Colby College. So these were multifaceted. I mean, what's fascinating to me, you sort of wish they were alive, is he was definitely an entrepreneur because he paid for med school. He went to Bowdoin, the medical school in Maine at Bowdoin. Mm-hmm. He paid for it by opening a rooming house and charged the other medical students. He hired a cook or something, and that paid for his med school. And at the same time he was in med school, he was also the superintendent of schools in Etna, Maine, which is where he was from. Which, when you drive, which I drove it this summer or this fall, it's about 70 miles. So once a month he'd take a carriage. And I can't imagine, I'm thinking, wow, this drive is, an hour and a half or something like that. And who knows what it was exactly to do it.
Right.
And when I was in Maine this summer, his house was for sale across from the library in that hometown.
Huh. Okay.
Did he have his office in his house?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so thank you very much for writing the book.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Don Dupre, you're next. Just unmute.
Hey, hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Don.
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I was intrigued by some of Dr. Metcalf's notes about birth weights of his deliveries. And I think the largest one was 10.5 pounds or 11.5 pounds, and the lightest one was 4.5 or so. And I think he listed the average weight of being over 8 pounds, which I was sort of surprised at. It seems quite a healthy birth weight, and I wonder if it reflects the general state of nutrition or health of the community at that time.
I think your guess is as good as mine. I have no
right.
idea
It's
why the
11.5 pounds
babies were
was
so
the
healthy.
Yeah.
You would think that in New England, nutrition would be a bit of a problem. I mean, there's a long winter, and access to fruits and vegetables for a good part of the year would be a problem in those days. Obviously, the babies were doing quite well. Don't know.
It's worth saying also that these were virtually no forceps, rarely used that sort of instrument, probably weren't trained in it. 0 section rate. I mean, cesarean sections weren't done, period. And you're right, the largest baby was 11.5 pounds that he recorded in his 300 deliveries. So, yeah.
Dr. Metcalf spoke very strongly against the use of forceps and ergot. I think he recorded that he did use ergot twice.
Right.
But that was all in his hundreds and hundreds of deliveries. I think some of the other doctors in the group were using both. They talk about the fact that they could hurry the delivery up and get on to the next patient in some of their papers. So,
yeah. I was also surprised that the lowest birth weight was 4.5 pounds, and there weren't smaller premature babies that he listed.
I don't think they were always called. And so I have a feeling that if a woman delivered very prematurely, it was taken care of without calling the doctor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bruce Bertrand.
Here I am? No?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. So I was curious about what your personal feelings are about how women were treated both medically and socially during that period. You, Sandy, as a woman, and Dale as an obstetrician.
Dale, you go first.
Yeah, well, this was a rural economy. I think that the notion of the family was pretty strong. People were family-centered and home-centered. Each had their roles. Yeah, I think that's about as far as I can go with regard to what I've learned from this book.
I think that that's obviously true, and probably women were feeling as they moved from an agrarian to an industrial, they probably became more insignificant with that move, which was probably a struggle.
Yes. Yeah.
As patients, doctors very often in their papers talked about how they thought that the women were overly emotional or they weren't as sick as they made out to be. There was some denigration of women in by some doctors more than others.
I
They
was
definitely
impressed with
made them as more emotionally volatile than their male patients were.
Yeah. I would say that the tone of this book you wrote with regard to the reports that you selected for it reflected a tone of respect and concern, as well as, curiosity and humility on the part of the doctors that I found actually rather reassuring.
Yeah.
Peter Lindblad, let me get you unmuted. There. Peter?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Peter.
Two things. One, Rene Laennec invented the stethoscope in 1816. So you were wondering about the date. And he was considered the father of clinical auscultation. The other question I had is medications used back then. Were they mostly herbal or what did they have?
They were both herbal and chemical. There was things like arsenic, mercury was a big one. So they spanned the whole spectrum. All of the doctors, I think, in this group had herbal gardens, and they all made their own medicines. That was another source of income. There were medicines for sale as well. They talk about some Dover's powders and different things, but it wasn't all herbal. There was certainly lots of chemicals, antimony, and as a matter of fact, as late as it took me a long time, and they had something called the blue pill, which was mercury. And I guess Abraham Lincoln, much later, was taking the blue pill for his depression until he realized that the mercury could be dangerous, and he stopped taking it. But it was a very, very common prescription.
How about leeches?
There's some discussions of leeches, but they use them in a few cases, not very many. And I think maybe leeches were, to get the right kind of leeches was an expensive proposition, so they weren't used frequently, but they did use them. They had many methods of bleeding you. They had the lancet, of course. They had something called a scarifier, which would make multiple incisions at once. They did something called cupping, which were used heat and vacuum to draw blood. So they had a lot of ways to bleed you. That wasn't a problem, but the leeches were not commonly used by this group that they reported anyway.
So so we have Julie with a question, and Alan Ward wants to make a comment as well. So first, Julie, what I'm going to do, Julie, just to make it a little quicker, is I'm just going to unmute you here, and you can make your comment.
Yeah, so it's easy to I'll just read what I put in there. It's easy to dismiss all of heroic medicine as completely ineffectual, which probably most of it was. But could any of it actually have worked? Just a little bit, enough so that these otherwise reasonable, educated, curious docs would have kept using it. Like there was one example that you listed of a severe headache after a birth, and then she was bled, I forget how many ounces, and then her headache went away. Maybe that was reducing intravascular volume and thus helping with the preeclampsia with severe features. Or maybe it did work as a muscle relaxant, where they bled someone before reduction. And I'm sure there was a huge stress purging, etc. And sometimes all you need is some prednisone or cortisol. No way.
I'm not a doctor. I don't know what would be effective and what wouldn't. I know that the only success in any disease fear that they had was with smallpox, obviously, because they had the inoculations, and so smallpox was pretty well understood and taken care of, even though they still had outbreaks of it. But as for making statements, I don't know. It's even hard to tell exactly what they were doing. The medicine, things that they described They may use some of the same terminology that we do, but it might not mean the same thing. They must have had 5 or 6 different names for what they called scarlet fever. How do you go about assessing it when it's being reported that way? I don't know.
Yeah. The other piece here is that we're bumping into the industrial age, and I think the mindset of society as a whole is kind of moving into a different frame. And so you see people thinking in terms of being a little more systematic about getting things done, a little more uniform, and beginning to start to think about measuring things. Part of the problem we're running into with heroic medicine is that it was handed down, it was tradition, it was based on an authority figure's advice and logic, but people weren't really doing much in the way of measuring results and of thinking through the physiology and making the discoveries they needed to more closely link a treatment to a disease and into physiology. So I think that's part of what was happening. And what I took as reassuring from this book is that these doctors were questioning what they were taught. They were questioning the results they had. They were saying, is there a better way? What would you do? Maybe there's something none of us has figured out quite yet. Maybe even some of those people with the alternative medicines have a point. So those sorts of things were creeping in, and it kind of set the table for infectious disease and hygiene and the discoveries such as anesthesia and the like that came afterwards.
You're right about
I'm sorry, Sandy.
The box was used as a database, and there are a number of times when one of the doctors would say, let me take the box home and go through the papers and see what we have done in the past and what worked. And they were really trying to figure this out, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. So Alan Ward wanted to say something. Alan, you're on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Just to be a little more modern, my grandfather, Roy Ward, graduated from Dartmouth Medical School in 1900. And went to Worcester in 1903. It was interesting because it was a sort of holdover from the earlier days. My grandfather described taking the train throughout New Hampshire, Vermont, and collecting cadavers for the medical students, for instance, and getting around in horse and sleigh or horse and wagon, which is rather interesting. But on the other hand, he has college educated, and he was graduated from Dartmouth Medical School, which was, of course, well known, but traveled through all of this time through the pre-antibiotic era and then the antibiotics, and he practiced until 1964, which was really quite interesting. But the contrast between collecting cadavers and surgery was quite something. And then one other comment, one of my granddaughters is doing obstetrics at Brown University, and she got really fired up by this Roe versus Wade issue, and sent me for Christmas a book that overlaps with yours by James Moore called Abortion in America, and it's from 1800 to 1900. But just all emphasizing the abortion and how it accelerated hugely towards 1870, like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 births, pregnancies was terminated. Interesting stuff.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So it looks like we're at the end of our hour. I'd really like to thank you, Sandy, for joining us. This was the best book club meeting ever. And I'm so glad to have had a chance to talk to you, as well as, the opportunity to read this really, really terrific book that you produced. To those who are still on the webinar, if you would be interested in joining the book club, let us know. You can just put something in the chat or the like. Also, I'd like to again say that we are sponsoring a medical history tour of England June 6 to 15, with a professional medical history tour guide. I've been on these tours before. They are excellent. And there are other resources at our website. If you go to the history section, we have photographs of our artifacts. We have several of the books dealing with history of medicine in this region, translated to electronic books, so they're available there as well. So with that, again, thank you, Sande, and I'll bid everyone a good evening.